Alright, writing this script for a third time. Let's hope I don't fall into the trap of just recapping the entire season again. Hello everyone, this is Loco. I'm back with another of my stupid opinions. This time on RWBY Volume 8. This video should honestly have been out a month ago when the volume ended, but college finals kinda got in the way and kept me busy. Then I tried to write the script and just ended up recapping the plot of the volume twice, but now I'm finally done with my finals, and during that time, my channel actually passed 100 subscribers. So I want to thank you all so much. I'll be calling this review my 100 subscriber special as an apology for taking so long. This is also going to be one of my longest review videos to date. But now that I've actually had time to put the review together, let's get into it. I've kept you all waiting long enough. Spoiler warning for the entirety of RWBY ahead, of course, including Volume 8. First off, I'm going to talk about the story and character arcs. I thought it was a very good decision on the writer's part to split the main cast into separate groups from one another, and not even just along the team lines, but along an ideological line. Atlas was, of course, a mess at the end of last volume, so it makes perfect sense that our heroes would be conflicted on what to do next. Also, splitting up certain characters, specifically the romantic pairs, putting Ren and Nora on separate teams, as well as Yang and Blake, gave each of them a lot of room to develop on their own. Nora, especially, is a shining example of this, as throughout the season we get a good amount of character development for someone who's primarily been used as comic relief before now. Now that she's apart from Ren, a character she's practically been obsessed with, she was able to start some development that I sincerely hope continues in the next volume, or in what it seems like Rooster Teeth might be going for, the next book from E.C. Myers. I'll talk about that possibility later at the end of the video. Ren also naturally gets a lot of character development in this season, continuing his arc that was hinted at back in Volume 7. Ren has apparently been holding back a lot of his objections to their group's actions since they arrived in Atlas, with him blaming his allies for the current situation, and when he finally vents his frustrations, it forces Yang's group to defend their own choices against Ironwood's plan. Additionally, once he finally breaks free of his emotional turmoil, we get our first real example of semblance evolution in the series, with Ren now being able to sense other people's emotions at the cost of his aura. I suppose you could count Weiss's summoning as semblance evolution too, but that was something we always knew she was going to be able to pull off eventually, she just needed to practice it more. Focusing on the other pair that was split up now, Yang gets a bit more character development in this volume, though not much. And by not much, I mean there's basically only one line hinting at actual development, and it's not even something Yang herself says.
It's okay to be afraid, you know. You don't always have to hide it with a joke.
The relationship between RWBY and Yang is touched on quite a bit, which is something I actually thought was pretty interesting, starting with them splitting off at the beginning, and then getting some closure with their conversation in the Schnee Manor. But overall, it just feels a little bit underutilized. Like, there was some setup for really great moments with RWBY trying to contact Yang, afraid she's ignoring her. There could have been a really great conversation between RWBY and Blake about the sisters' relationship, but all we get is a brief mention. And then when Yang asks Jean,
"Do you think she thinks less of me?"
I feel like it would have had a much greater impact if she actually was talking about RWBY instead of Blake. Speaking of Blake, she's extremely underutilized once again, and barely does anything in this volume, which is a massive missed opportunity in my book. We get a brief conversation about how RWBY inspires her that, frankly, comes out of nowhere. It's welcome all the same, but that's about it, unfortunately. It feels like ever since Volume 5, the writers have been scared to actually try and give Blake some character development again, since, from what I understand, a lot of people really hated her arc in Volume 4 and 5, and ever since then she's done basically nothing. I disagree, I actually really liked her arc in Volume 5, but that's beside the point for now, we're talking about Volume 8. Then when she does do something, it usually only ends up being to feed into the whole Bumblebee ship, which, at this point, I'm getting really tired of. Like, I'm not a huge fan of the ship, but I also don't mind if it ends up becoming canon, which, as of now, seems like it almost definitely will. The problem is we keep getting these little ship baiting moments, but we haven't had almost any actual conversations or emotional moments between the two since Volume 6.
Do you think we should have told Ironwood about Salem before he put so much on the line for Amity?
Yeah, they touch heads here. Blake is the one to have the massive breakdown when Yang falls instead of, Yang's literal sister, but never once do the two actually have a meaningful conversation in this volume or in Volume 7. If the writers are going to make this ship canon, they need to put the work in and give these two actual moments where they can connect. Otherwise, their relationship is going to feel very forced in the end. And as of now, it still feels very forced. They've been hinting at this since the ending of Volume 5. That's 3 whole seasons. 4 if you count Volume 4 because of that Bumblebee song in the soundtrack. And only in Volume 6 do these two have any meaningful interactions. Like, look at the way She-Ra and the Princesses of Power handled its relationships. It gave them time, gave the characters actual emotional moments together instead of just being, ooh, look, they're holding hands all the time. Hell, look at Ren and Nora in this exact same volume. They barely spend any time together, but their relationship makes more progress in this volume alone than Blake and Yang's has in the last 3 volumes. But that's enough ranting about something I didn't like. Let's talk about something I did like a lot. Cinder is finally an actual character, with character development. After 6 long volumes of not knowing her motives, of her not learning from her mistakes, we finally have both a full backstory and some progression for her character. And her backstory, it's just Dark Cinderella. But in all seriousness, I actually like Cinder's backstory a lot. Is it simple? Yes. Did it intrigue me all the same? Yes. And most importantly, did it give us the answers we were looking for? Kind of. While it would have been nice to see how she actually met Salem and came to be Salem's chosen vessel for the Maiden Powers, the parts of the story we are shown give us what we so desperately needed, helping us understand Cinder's motivations for being as twisted and cruel as she is. A lot of people are upset with how basic her backstory is, but to be honest, I don't mind it one bit. A lot of the main cast has some pretty complex backstories, namely Yang, Blake, Ozpin, and Salem. So having a character whose backstory is simple and easy to understand is a nice change of pace. Additionally, throughout this volume, Cinder actually learns from her previous failures, learning that not everything is going to be handed to her on a silver platter just because she's strong. She has to be smart about things too. And where does this lesson come from, you may ask? Well, none other than Watts, one of the people she despises the most. And oh my god, that monologue from Watts is just absolutely phenomenal.
You can't just be deserving, you have to be worthy. But all you have ever been is a bloody migraine.
Honestly, there's just a lot of good monologues in this volume in general. Watts chewing out Cinder, Ironwood's I have one bomb speech, Ozpin trying to reason with Hazel. These scenes are all absolutely fantastic. While we're talking about the villains, we might as well talk about the 3 others with major character arcs, starting with Hazel. Hazel is a fairly frequent presence throughout the middle part of this volume, being tasked with torturing Ozpin/Oscar for the password to the Relic of Knowledge. We actually get some reasoning behind why Hazel follows Salem, too, which I thought was handled very well, and fixes some of his major writing flaws from Volume 5. This leads to him discovering the truth for himself, that Salem plans to destroy the world and not create a new world order, and ends up sacrificing himself to allow Oscar, Yang's group, and the now traitorous Emerald to escape. A very simple but effective arc for his character. I very much like this. As for Emerald herself, her arc might have seemed good on paper, and they've been building up to this through small scenes in Volume 5 and 6, but the execution here in Volume 8 is just massively disappointing. For the first 6 episodes of the season, we see her trying to get back into Cinder's good graces, and then when episode 9 rolls around, she betrays Salem and escapes with Yang's group, without mentioning Cinder once for the rest of the volume. It very much feels like we're missing a scene or two where she comes to terms with the fact that Cinder doesn't, and probably never did, care about her, that finally pushes her to leave Salem. After all, the only reason Emerald was working with her to begin with was because of her loyalty to Cinder. Then in episode 10, we do get some really good scenes with Yang's group and Emerald, and their distrust of one another, but at the end of the next episode, that's just completely forgotten, with one of the most unnatural and cliche lines this series has ever had.
Look, I'm just going to be super pissed if you all finally decide to give up the moment I switch sides.
And then everyone completely trusts Emerald for the rest of the volume. Overall, they just needed more time to flesh out each of these plot points for Emerald, make them naturally flow into one another instead of just jumping from one point to the next. The last of our villains that has a major character arc is Ironwood, and for the most part, it's simply continuing his descent into madness that began at the end of Volume 7. This volume begins with him murdering Councilman Sleet when the other council members oppose his declaration of martial law, and his decisions continue to escalate as he becomes more and more unhinged as the volume progresses. A lot of people think that his character arc doesn't make any sense in this volume, but I'd actually disagree. Even disregarding his semblance, Metal, which allows him to hyper-focus on a specific goal without worrying about morals or any physical pain he endures, at the end of last volume, Ironwood found out that some of the people he trusted most, namely Team RWBY and Oscar, not only lied to him, but also actively went against his orders and carried out their own plan. He let his own fear of Salem control him, and even though these decisions he makes in this volume might not make sense to someone in their right mind, he's clearly not in his right mind. And throughout this season, more and more people he once trusted betray him, only pushing him further off the edge. The Aesops question his orders until Marrow eventually speaks out against him, Winter lets Yang's group go after capturing them, and eventually she full-on betrays him too. Ironwood is losing anyone else he could have relied on, and he is orchestrating a war against one of the most powerful forces in history. That would be enough to drive anyone insane. While we're on the topic of the Aesops and Winter, I'm gonna group them all together since their character arcs are so closely tied to one another. From the beginning of the season, we see that Marrow doesn't really believe in Ironwood's command anymore, and spend the entire season waiting, and waiting, and waiting for him to finally do something about it. Harriet, meanwhile, is on the opposite end of the spectrum, following whatever Ironwood says with blind loyalty. Her arc is kind of interesting, but I just find it hard to care about it when the other characters she interacts with in regards to this, Crow, Robin, Vine, etc., are just written so painfully boring in this season. Crow and Robin do next to nothing until the finale, and even then what they do has next to no actual bearing on the plot other than wrapping up Harriet's arc. Vine sacrifices himself after doing nothing all season, and because the writers just neglected to actually make him a character over the last 2 seasons, his sacrifice just feels pointless. And Elm's just kind of there. She doesn't really do anything at all. Winter is probably the most interesting out of all these characters, but her arc is very predictable, with her eventually betraying Ironwood and helping the main heroes with their arc. Her becoming the Winter Maiden at the end of the season was an interesting choice, but unfortunately it comes at the cost of undoing all the hard work spent on another character's arc throughout the last 2 seasons. Now, if you saw my Quickie Thoughts video that I posted on the same day of the season finale's release, you know how I feel about Penny's final fate in this volume. I make it no secret that Penny is one of my favorite characters in the series, and the fact that she's been featured so prominently in this volume and last volume has had me more than thrilled. And for most of this volume, I actually liked her character arc a lot. Definitely the most interesting part of the season for me. She has to face the consequences of becoming the Winter Maiden at the end of the last volume, forcing her, and by extension her father Pietro, to think about the big picture of the war against Salem rather than how Penny might be able to help in the short term. Additionally, I loved the way they used Watt's virus to play into her character arc, and the way it interconnected a bit with Nora's around the middle of the season. And the way it was resolved, using the Staff of Creation to create a real human body for Penny, was a genius idea, really playing into the key fairy tale inspiration of Pinocchio. However, it's once we get to the season finale that the writers take the entire character arc and throw it in the garbage. Penny is killed off in order to buy time for her friends to escape, transferring the Winter Maiden powers to Winter, since that's what Cinder is really after. While I did think that Penny asking Jean to kill her was an interesting touch, and actually something I missed out on the first time I watched the finale because I was so enraged they were killing her off in the first place, the reasoning behind it is so contrived, and ultimately it just feels unnecessary. You're telling me not one of the other characters here, Weiss, Jean, eventually Winter, not one of them could have died instead of a character we've already seen die once. That's the part of this that's the most frustrating. We've already seen Penny die once back in Volume 3. If you were just going to kill her off again in this volume, what was the narrative point of bringing her back in the first place? Her brief exchange with Winter when she transfers the powers is nice, but it also could have played out almost the exact same way if Winter had been the one to die instead of Penny. Let's start talking fully hypothetical. Let's say that the finale opened up with a full, uninterrupted fight between Winter and Ironwood. Winter beats Ironwood fair and square without the need for any maiden powers. That alone would have been a more satisfying end for Winter's bare-bones arc. And then, during the final battle with Penny, Jean, and Weiss versus Cinder, Winter could have shown up, handled Cinder to buy the others time, and while Jean and Weiss would still end up falling once Cinder uses the staff, Penny could swoop back and save Winter, who is collapsed and dying. and as they fly to the gateway and manage to escape, Winter could have the same conversation with Penny that she does in the actual episode, reaffirming Penny's character arc that she is more than just a machine. I personally feel like that would have been a much more satisfying ending for both Winter and Penny's arcs, instead of unnaturally shoehorning in the death of a character who's already died once before. As for the rest of our cast, they don't really get much character development this volume. Weiss reconciles with her family in the most unnatural way possible, Ruby gets stressed out by the hopelessness of the situation, Crow and Robin sit in a prison cell for literally 2/3 of the season, and Maria and Pietro are completely forgotten about after episode 5. Salem has some really great presence as a villain this volume, until she's basically nuked 4 episodes before the finale. As a whole, RWBY has been suffering from just having too big of a main cast, and not enough time to fully develop all of these characters. I mean, even looking at the major heroes, we have 10 characters, and only about half of them actually get any development this volume. The ones that do generally have some pretty good character arcs, but then we spend a lot of time developing side characters that are unnaturally forced into the plot, and ultimately don't affect it in any major way. And while a few of the episodes do focus on individual characters, namely Amity focusing on Penny and Midnight focusing on Cinder, I ultimately feel like we needed more of these kinds of episodes to flesh out each character and give them something to do in this season. The overall plot is pretty good for the most part. Yang's group is easily one of the most interesting, starting out trying to help the citizens of Mantle evacuate into the crater before Oscar gets kidnapped by the Hound and they change course to rescue him. Speaking of the Hound, it is easily one of the best parts of this volume. Easily the most intimidating Grimm, beating the apathy out in my opinion, as well as one of the most powerful, and the story and implications behind its existence make me very excited to see where they go with this. I do feel like it wasn't used to its full potential, being killed off just after the halfway point of the volume, but I definitely liked what we got. RWBY's group gets their job done really easily, and unfortunately they're mostly sidelined in the Schnee manner for episodes 4 through 8. And while this would have been a great time to get some character development in for any of these characters really, all we get is Weiss's rushed reconciliation with her family. May does get some brief time to shine, and we get the very first mention of the fact in the show that she's transgender, which I thought was very well handled. Good on you, RWBY. Now, let's just hope they're able to fix Bumblebee in the next few volumes so we can have some good lesbian representation that's actually natural and not ridiculously forced. While RWBY's group handles the Hound, Oscar ends up convincing Hazel and Emerald to switch sides within Monstra, and Yang's group rushes into the Whale to save them after getting picked up by the Aesops, and Salem begins her attack on Atlas. Long story short, Monstra gets nuked using the stored up energy in the Long Memory, Neo escapes with the Relic of Knowledge, and our heroes manage to escape after Hazel sacrifices himself. This, unfortunately, is where the season starts to take a turn for the worse. The general ideas here are good, like Ironwood dropping his bomb on Mantle, the heroes using the Staff of Creation to evacuate the refugees from Atlas and Mantle to Vacuo, and our 4 main heroes, plus Jean and Neo, falling into another world entirely and being separated from the rest of the main cast. But the execution here really leaves a lot to be desired. Plus, removing the threat of Salem from the picture makes the last third of this volume feel very disconnected from the first 2/3. Personally, if it were up to me, I would have actually had the events of episodes 1 through 9 be stretched out to encompass the entire volume. Give more detail to the events that occur, for example, not skipping over how Jean, Ren, and Yang are actually able to get inside of Monstra, as well as allowing for more character development moments throughout the season without it feeling like a waste of time. I would also rewrite it so that Ironwood's climactic fight with Winter happens around the same time as Oscar nuking Monstra and Salem. I would have also pushed the stuff with the Staff of Creation to be the kickoff for the next volume, rather than the ending to this one. Of course, not knowing what they have planned for Volume 9 yet, I don't know how that would affect that volume, but pushing these events back a bit would help Volume 8 itself to feel more cohesive as a story, rather than introducing all of these new plot elements suddenly at the end, and creating an entirely new conflict for the last 3 episodes. Of course, that isn't what happened, and instead we got Cinder monologuing, Penny dying again, Winter becoming the Winter Maiden anyways, rushing everyone to Vacuo without explaining anything, Harriet going completely crazy, Vine pointlessly sacrificing himself, and some really disappointing action. And the worst part is, the show kind of breaks its own rules to get this result. I mean, we never actually see Penny's aura break on screen, and yet Cinder somehow wounds her badly enough for her to collapse and be too weak to escape. Sure, the same kind of thing happened back in the Volume 7 finale, with Crow acting very out of character and teaming up with Tyrion, resulting in Clover's death, but this isn't just someone acting out of character. This is the show breaking its own rules of combat just to achieve a result that was honestly pretty disappointing in the first place. But that's enough talking about the story. I've literally spent the last 5 pages of script talking about the story alone. Let's talk about some of the other aspects of this season, starting with the general animation. And the animation in this volume is kind of all over the place. There are scenes like when Ironwood makes his announcement, the Atlesian soldiers lining up in the fields to counterattack Salem and Monstra, and of course, the scene where Monstra is destroyed. Like, these sequences are easily some of the best animated in the entire series. However, there's also a few shots that are, I'm not gonna lie, they're pretty terrible. Young Cinder tackling this boy at the orphanage, the ship flying up into the Vault of the Winter Maiden, etc. For the rest of the volume, the animation is generally pretty good. Nothing great, but not bad either. About the same as Volume 7, though with notably less 2D visual effects due to there being less action in general. Now, in relation to the animation, let's talk about the action choreography, which, just like the animation, is kind of all over the place. I'm gonna go through each fight in the volume, say what I liked or didn't like about it, and then move on, so let's get into that. I'm gonna be ignoring the minor scenes like Yang's group fighting the Grimm and Oscar getting kidnapped by the Hound, because they're so brief that there's really not much to talk about here. First up, we've got Penny versus the Aesops, and this fight starts off really good, being fast-paced and giving each character a chance to shine. Unfortunately, about halfway through, the fight slows way down, and most of the time is spent either watching Penny charge up to use her maiden powers, or watching the Aesops setting up for a heavy-hitting attack that usually ends up missing. It also ends very anticlimactically, with Marrow using his semblance to freeze Penny in place before Nora busts the others out of the data vault, and then the Aesops steal one of Penny's swords. Overall, I give it a 7 out of 10. Then we have Yang, Ren, and Jean chasing down the Hound. Now, this scene really blew me away when I first saw it, and having an action sequence set on bikes is something very different from past sequences in the series. Ren using his weapon to grapple onto the Hound as it flies is a fantastic idea, and the climax with Ren saving Yang and Jean from falling by grappling onto Jean's grounded sword is also fantastic. The biggest thing holding this one back is that it's relatively short, 8 out of 10. Next, we have my personal favorite fight in the volume, being Penny versus Cinder and Maria versus Neo. This fight is absolutely phenomenal, being fast-paced yet clear in its action, while also having emotional moments when the fight naturally slows down. Cinder pushes Penny to her limits, forcing her to choose between saving herself and the maiden powers, and between saving her father and Amity. Additionally, getting to see the elderly Maria fighting, especially fighting someone as nimble as Neo, and completely showing her up, is incredibly entertaining. Plus, it ends with probably one of the most emotional moments in the series, Penny falling from Amity as the virus takes over. Only complaint I have is that Emerald was here, but was basically useless outside of messing with Penny and Maria's minds once each. They really could have done something more with her. But anyways, this scene as a whole is an easy 9 out of 10. In the next episode, we get a really brief fight between Cinder and her mentor, Rhodes, in Cinder's flashback. And when I say brief, I mean really brief, as in less than a minute long. What we do see of this fight is really good. I especially like the contrast between Cinder's heat-based semblance and Rhodes' semblance allowing him to turn his skin to metal. But overall, this fight is just way too short for its own good. 6 out of 10. Then, after having no real fights in Episode 7, we get everyone at the Schnee Manor versus the Hound in Episode 8. This fight is interesting because it's not just a fight scene, but also a brief stealth sequence featuring Whitley and Willow. But unfortunately, there's not a whole lot of actually fighting the Hound. The characters just kind of run and hide from it until eventually RWBY uses Grim Nuke and stuns it so the Schnees can drop a statue on it. RWBY and Blake are mostly occupied with a massive Centaur Grim outside, and while the choreography here is okay, I feel like its only purpose here is to keep RWBY and Blake from actually fighting the Hound, which is a real shame as that could have been interesting. The best part of this sequence is getting to see Penny succumbing to the virus and trying to escape the manor. Overall, 6 out of 10. Next up, we have Yang's group plus Hazel and Emerald versus Salem. Though, calling it that is a bit of a stretch, as the only one who really gets to fight Salem is Hazel. After everyone gets a few hits on her, Salem immobilizes all of them with some Grim Arms, until Hazel betrays Salem, and his fighting style really gets to shine here, as we see him using like 4 or 5 different types of dust in his body all at once. It gets absolutely brutal, with him killing Salem over and over until eventually setting himself on fire to keep her steady so Oscar can deal the finishing blow. Unfortunate that the others don't really get to join the fight here. It would have been really interesting to see Emerald going up against Salem, but what we got here was still pretty great. 8 out of 10. We then go like 2 episodes without a real fight until we eventually get Ironwood versus basically everyone. The fight choreography here is really interesting and fast-paced, and everyone gets to do something. Unfortunately, the fight only lasts about 45 seconds and then it just ends, which is extremely disappointing because with a few changes, this could have been the best fight in the volume. Ironwood has due process in this kind of canon form thing, and the reasoning as to why is just, well, I was gonna say it makes no sense, but the reasoning isn't even there to begin with. It honestly felt like it was just there to handicap him in this fight, and the later fight between him and Winter. And after the fantastic fight between him and Watts last volume, the fact that we don't get to see this weapon used more creatively is extremely disappointing. This fight also just deserved to be longer. I get that Ironwood is outnumbered and that him being defeated quickly makes sense, but for as phenomenal as this fight choreography is, I just wish there was more of it. 7 out of 10. Then we have Winter versus Ironwood, which is, it's okay. Winter is known for being a speed-based fighter, but her movements are noticeably slower than a lot of her other action sequences. Probably to match Ironwood's handicap because he's still using his stupid cannon thing instead of his actual guns. Unfortunately, this fight suffers yet again from not being long enough. Hell, it's practically only 2 minutes long, with a long cut after it barely gets started, then Winter gets the maiden powers, reflects a beam back at Ironwood, and leaves to help everyone else. Overall, a fight that had a ton of potential was ultimately wasted. Though, I do have to give it props for having the characters actually talk while they fight, instead of stopping the battle so someone can monologue. I really wish they did this kind of thing more often. 5 out of 10. Finally, across the last 2 episodes, we get a lot of people I'm too lazy to individually mention versus Cinder and Neo, and this fight is just really boring. Cinder stands atop her pillar of flame monologuing until Neo shows up, casting Yang into the pit, before having Ruby and Blake fend off Neo for like 10 seconds before cutting to Weiss and Cinder throwing ice and fire at each other. Yeah, that's some really interesting stuff there. The rest of the fight is basically Weiss just defending herself from Cinder's attacks, then Cinder and Penny fighting from these long distance shots that make it basically impossible to see any of the actual choreography. Not just that, but this fight stretches into the next episode, doing basically the exact same shit as the first half of this fight, but now with Penny begging for someone to kill her every 10 seconds to get Cinder off their backs. Gee, that's subtle, isn't it? Ruby and Blake fall, Jean shows up very briefly, Penny gets injured and Jean kills her, then Winter shows up as the maiden and does almost nothing. Weiss falls, Cinder uses the staff, and Jean falls. The problem is, I feel like I should be entertained, what with so much going on throughout this entire fight, but then they stop fighting every 30 seconds to have Penny beg someone to kill her, or just to have someone yell at Cinder for being a complete bitch, or literally anything instead of just actually fighting. Not to mention this fight, as well as the previous fight, and the Aesop's climax all suffer from the fact that the episode is just cutting between each of these like once a minute. It makes it extremely difficult to keep track of what's actually going on in these fights. Like, can't we just focus on one of these at a time? It would be so much easier to understand, and probably would have made each fight in general more enjoyable to watch. I'm not going to be talking about Crow versus Harriet because basically all Crow does is swing his sword at Harriet a couple times and then it's over. Overall, I'd give this last fight a 4 out of 10. Overall, the action in this volume was pretty disappointing, especially coming off some of the amazing fight scenes from Volume 7. I mean, Volume 7 gave us Ironwood versus Watts, Team RWBY versus the Aesops, Crow versus Tyrion versus Clover. Sometimes I go back and watch the later episodes of Volume 7 just for these fights. But Volume 8, the only fights I've actually been tempted to go back and watch are the chase scene with the Hound and Penny versus Cinder. I can only guess that the pandemic had a major impact on Volume 8's production, and that's why we had some of the major animation issues I mentioned earlier, and why some of the fights were so short. Honestly, the volume as a whole just feels extremely rushed. At this point, I wish Rooster Teeth would have delayed the whole volume to fix up the script, change some plot points around, and spend more time on the animation to give some real substance to each of these fight scenes. It overall just would have made for a much better volume. One last thing before I cap off this review, it really seems like we're going to be getting another RWBY novel from E.C. Myers. For those who don't know, there are a couple of RWBY light novels focusing on Team Coffee's adventures in Vacuo, and they're absolutely phenomenal. The reason I bring this up is because the climax of the last novel seems to happen around the same time as the climax of Volume 8, meaning that the next RWBY novel might push some of our main characters' stories, namely Ren, Nora, Oscar, and Emerald, into the next novel instead of Volume 9. I'd love to be wrong, as these characters' adventures deserve to be a part of the main series, but it is a definite possibility. Regardless, I do hope that we get another one of these novels, and even if these 4 are involved somehow, I just hope that the writers find a good way to balance the story between the main show and the novels. With that said, that's gonna be the end of this long-ass review. Overall, despite what my ranting may have made it seem like, I did like this volume a lot. It was just the finale left such a bad taste in my mouth. Overall, I'd say that Volume 7 is still my favorite, with Volume 3 close behind it, but I'd put Volume 8 at a tie with Volume 6 for my third favorite volume right now. There was a lot of things that I liked, a lot that I didn't, but overall, I enjoyed it. Thanks for taking the time to watch my review through to the end. I know that this has probably been a really long video compared to my previous ones, but I hope to be a little bit more active now that my college courses are finally over for the semester. Thanks for 100 subscribers. Until next time, stay positive, you lovely people.